Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of In Your Wheelhouse, brought to you by Wheelhouse IT. I am your host, Todd Rosales, and we have an amazing episode for you today. For those of you who are watching the screen, you can already tell who my guest is. So typically, I'll fill this first 30 seconds with a little bit of hype and excitement to get you on board. But if you have watched any kind of hurricane coverage, you live in South Florida or anything else, you know that we have an amazing guest today and someone who we are honored and privileged to have on this show, a gentleman who has showed up at my house uninvited numerous times, but every time I see him there, I'm always happy to have him. He is our local meteorologist because I live in South Florida, so I get to see him quite often. But here we really get to dig into his experiences and everything that he's done for Florida and everywhere else over the past, 20, 30 years. Please welcome Bryan Norcross, hurricane specialist and director of meteorology. Bryan, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate you doing this.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you very much.
Oh, absolutely, man. So I've seen you on my TV many times, and when storms are approaching South Florida, we're very glued to the news down here, right? It's literally something that's on my TV so much to the point when the storm passes, it's almost like my wedding. Like all we did was talk about my wedding, leading up to the wedding. The wedding came and it was over. It's like, well, what do we do with our lives now? We don't have that topic to talk about, and that storm feels the same way. It's weird to me that still in 2020, we're glued to our TVs looking for our information on disasters. We're not looking at our phones or our computer screens or anything else. Do you think that's a trend that's going to continue to happen, that we're going to look to our local professionals for disaster advice?
I think that it'll happen perhaps in a different form because, there are people now, we're up in the 10 or 15% range that don't have TV, that with digital television in the United States and the kind of poor system that we have where you can't really have a portable system of TV like we did back in Hurricane Andrew, by the way, in 1992, a bunch of people had little portable battery operated black and white TVs. But now that we've gone to digital and the system they chose here was not made for mobile, that's getting replaced by streaming on your phone. The difference is that you can't stream on your phone day and night. It's just not a practical thing to do.
Yeah.
And anybody that's been through it knows that the information changes, right? You have these surges of information that come in on different timescales. The National Hurricane Center advisories come in every 3 or 6 hours, 3 hours when it gets closer, and then sometimes more than that. But also you get new computer models, but you also get new satellite images and new radars that indicate, okay, is it turning a little bit to the right? So is it, less for Miami-Dade and more for Broward, or might it be turning a little farther north like has been predicted? And it's a drama that just continues to play out over that critical couple days as the storm is approaching the coast and there's a potential threat, because you never know exactly where the worst of it is going to go, right? You never know whether a particular location is going to get a fringe effect or is going to get the worst of the storm.
I imagine the hardest part about doing what you do, and I want to get into what you did with Andrew and everything else, because it's absolutely fascinating. And as I told you before we started rolling, I wasn't down here for Andrew, but it's something that you always hear about. You hear everybody's stories about their experiences. But as someone who has a responsibility to get the information out there, you do an amazing job. But I imagine it's very hard to kind of balance especially for the lower tier storms that we have, okay, folks, like, we're going to be okay, but you still need to prepare, because as people, like, we had mentioned that a Category 5 storm, with the exception of Michael last year, that hit the Panhandle, and we can make the argument that the Panhandle and South Florida are almost two completely different states and two completely different regions. Mm-hmm. We haven't been hit by a major storm since Andrew in 92. So I know I have this false sense of security, and I'm watching you, and it's like, and I said, unless it's a Cat 3, I don't blink. And I imagine, it's kind of like, I've heard this before. I don't know if I'm going to prepare, or I'm going to prepare a little bit, but there's not that sense of urgency anymore amongst the general public, which could be bad. I imagine the hardest part about doing your job when it isn't a major storm is, like, everybody can stay calm. We don't need to step on each other at Publix, but make sure you're prepared, versus, people with the solid sense of security. Hey, And I'm going to take some liberties here. Hey, idiots, go get your stuff. Go get prepared. This can be bad if you're not prepared. So I imagine that that's a delicate balance that you have to do when you're on TV every day.
It is, although Mother Nature has helped us out some, because Irma came along, just a few years ago now. So a lot of people remember the ordeal of Irma. And Irma was basically a tropical storm here. There were few hurricane force gusts, but it was very disruptive. And a lot of people, thought after the storm, boy, I really should have prepared better, right?
Yeah.
I should have more stuff here because there's no, the ATMs aren't working because the power's out, or whatever, other kinds of problems. So, in that regard, we have something to refer to that is a weaker level storm. When I say here, I mean in Miami-Dade and Broward County now. Now in the Keys, in part of the Keys, it was much stronger. It was a little bit stronger on the southwest coast, but it still wasn't that big a deal in the end. But talking to an audience in Southeast Florida, Irma is an example of a kind of disruptive, really annoying process from a fairly weak storm in terms of the wind. Then for people that have been here a little bit longer, in 2005, we had Wilma. And a lot of people, especially in Broward and Palm Beach County, remember Wilma as being really kind of bad. And it was barely a Category 2 in parts of those counties. In Miami-Dade County, it was a Category 1, but yet it took out Brickell Avenue in terms of being a functioning part of the city for a good while. And so those are pretty good examples. Wilma, if you think of the pictures of Brickell Avenue, look it up online. It was a mess. I mean, just lots of high-rise buildings with their windows blown out and so forth from a Category 1 hurricane. Not to mention the storm surge flooding up along 79th Street Causeway and other places, and even in Miami Beach. So that's what I roll out, right? For people to try and remind them that these storms are powerful things. Yes, the level of destruction is not going to be anything like it would be. It goes up kind of geometrically as you get to these higher categories. But Wilma at the time was, I want to say, the third most expensive hurricane in the history of hurricanes that came along. So it was a 20.6, sticks in my mind, $1 billion event. And it was a Category 1 in Miami-Dade, Category 2 in parts of Broward and Palm Beach County. So the amount of damage in a densely populated region that can occur from a low-end storm is still very, very high, and it can be obviously very disruptive.
Yeah, I remember that storm. I remember Wilma. I remember Irma, both specifically. And I think it's right that it's unfortunate that people, for some reason, need an experience that they can draw upon to be prepared for the next storm. So, what we do. We're a technology company, and we help businesses prepare for things like this: disaster recovery, business continuity, making sure that they're leveraging the right technology that, if we have something like a Wilma, and I remember my dad's business, which was just a local mechanic shop, was without power for like 2 or 3 weeks, right?
Right.
For a business can't be down that long. But I can tell you, if there's a younger crop of entrepreneurs that just graduated recently, they started the company young, they don't have that experience yet. So when we talk to them, they're kind of like gamblers, hey, I haven't seen, none of my friends have experienced this. I haven't experienced that. I'm going to take my chances. And then boom, they get hit by a storm. They get hit by an event. And, correct me if I'm wrong, our building codes and everything are great, but it doesn't take that power of a storm to have a little bit of a power outage in a certain area.
Right. No question about it. I mean, we haven't invested as a society, and I'm not saying we should have, in super resilient power system. Now, FP&L over the years, as these hurricanes have happened, they've made their system more and more resilient. It's smarter now. Talk about technology. It's a smarter system, so they can better kind of shut off areas and do things and know what's happened without actually having to go out and look physically and see, why isn't the power on? Oh, that broke. Now they don't have to do that as much, so they can be smarter about how they deploy their resources. But the power is going to go out. I mean, in any kind of significant storm, because trees and power lines don't mix. And you have the other threat that even in places where the power is underground power is great for garden variety hurricanes, for low end hurricanes, where it's basically a wind threat. But once you get into hurricanes that are more water threats, so either if you're near the coast, saltwater from the ocean or Biscayne Bay or some other water that's come in from the, connected to the ocean, saltwater.
Yeah.
Or in inland, remember that in Southeast Florida, the highest ground is where the city was originally developed, where the railroad was, where downtown Miami is, downtown Fort Lauderdale is. That's the high ground. It gets lower as you go west. So if it really rains, and if anybody that was around for Hurricane Irene in 1999, or we had another storm in 2000 called the No Name Storm, if we were to have something approaching a Hurricane Harvey, the one that hit Houston and caused that tremendous flood, right? We'd have a tremendous flood here as well, because for different reasons, but here generally it's because the land goes downhill to the west towards the Everglades. So that water that falls on the west side of the ridge is not coming out fast. It has to rain very, very slowly to the east. And so if you have underground power lines, that water is getting into the underground power system. So it can actually, if the water damages the underground power system, it can take longer to repair an underground system than it can to bring trucks and cherry pickers out and repair the overground system right after a storm. Yeah. And if you have salt water get into there, then you have a whole nother level of problems. So underground systems generally survive better, but in a super flood in kind of situation, which we haven't had in a long time. You have to go back 20 years really to have a big flood here, and that wasn't even a big flood when you look at the Harvey scale floods that Houston had a couple years ago. We haven't kind of dealt with that. But the whole idea of hurricanes equal power outages is well established, and I don't see anything that's going to change that.
100%, it's a given. And on your vein of using prior experiences to get people to understand things, as you say, the high ground is closer to the coast and where the city was developed, and the low ground is further west. If I recall correctly, as it was explained to me, that's what happened with New Orleans and Katrina, that New Orleans is basically a bowl. Mm-hmm. And, we can talk about where the pumps were and everything else, but all the stormwater flooded into the city and it just sat there. And essentially the east coast of Florida is very similar to that. It's like you said, it's not draining out. So if we have a bad storm with weather, I can see just still water sitting, down here for a while. And like you said, we can't defend against everything. Wires up, we'll defend against water. Wires down, we'll defend against wind and rain. We've got to find a mix of that. Now, you've been doing this for a very long time, and I know that you're very, very respected and renowned for what you did with Andrew, but I did some digging. I probably didn't dig too far, but I saw that you were actually very famous in Louisville in 1978. There was a storm that hit, and you were the only news person to be able to get on air. I mean, were you just the bravest one willing to drive through the storm? Did you happen to have the clearest path? I mean, that's incredible. Out of an entire city, you were the first and only one to get on air.
I was. It was a very bizarre story. I wasn't a news guy. I was not an on-air person. What happened was I had taken a new job in Louisville. I was coming from Denver, where I had been producing the news. The producer of the news is the person who decides what content is going to be in the news show on a given day. And I had been producing and directing actually the 10 o'clock news in Denver. And the company promoted me because that did very well. We more than doubled the ratings on that show. And they sent me to Louisville to run the news department there. And as news director was the title. So I was in town to look for an apartment. And I was staying at a motel down the street from the station for that night. And I was going to go look for apartments the next day and go by the station, say hello, and so forth and so on. And I had been in the station only once when I had been there for my interview. I walked in the back door and I walked through the newsroom, said hello to a couple of the anchor people, and met the general manager, turned around and went back to the airport, and flew back to Denver. So, and the reason I had to go back to Denver was because the Broncos were going to the Super Bowl to play the Dallas Cowboys, and they needed me there to produce the coverage, the Super Bowl coverage. So anyway, now I came back to look for an apartment. They offered me the job, took the job, came back to look for an apartment, and I'm staying in the same motel down the street. And there was snow forecast that evening, and I thought that was kind of cool. But it was just a regular snowfall forecast. Well, my phone rings in the motel at 5 o'clock in the morning, and it was the assignment editor. The assignment editor in the news department is the person who controls where the news crews go and what news gets covered in a day. And he had come from Denver previously, so I knew him from Denver. And he said, Brian, I don't know if you looked outside. I said, it's 5 o'clock in the morning. No, I haven't looked outside. But it's hellacious out there. We've had this incredible snow. I don't think I can get out. I don't think I can get to the station. You're the closest person. Maybe you should go over there, and just so you know that you're there, because this is going to be big. I said, sure. And so I get in the car, and it turned out that there was actually a photographer candidate who was in town for an interview as well from Oklahoma City, also staying in that motel, who I had met the day before. I woke him up. I said, we got to go into the station because there's been some big snowstorm, and the assignment editor doesn't think he can get in to run the news department. So we get in the car, and we had to plow our way. I had a 1976, I think it was, Ford LTD, a big old thing. And we had to plow our way through the snow, and I kind of ditched it down below the station, and the station was up on a hill, and kind of went around to the back door where I had been before. I started pounding on the back door in the cold and the snow, and a couple of engineers were there. That was the only people in the TV station. A couple of engineers were there, and I convinced them. I said, look, I'm the new news director. Let me in. and they said, okay. And so I went in and kind of remembered how it was laid out, and found the newsroom, and had to turn on the lights. I mean, everything was dark. Lights were off. Yeah. The monitors were turned on. Everything, the wire machines and everything. And so I'm kind of like investigating and hanging around, and I go talk to the engineers, and the photographer, who was a big help, who had come from Oklahoma City, was there. We were like, okay, let's see what's going on here. And it gets later and later, and at that time there was no news from 6 to 7 a.m. on this station. I don't think on any station. The news occurred in the Today Show, in Good Morning America, at 7:25, so forth. So about 6:30 normally, an anchor person came in to prepare those little newscasts. There was a very small staff in the morning, and the assignment editor came in. Well, it gets to be 6:30 and there's nobody there. It gets to be 7 o'clock and there's nobody there. So I go to the engineer. I say, who's supposed to be here? Oh, no, Fran's supposed to be here. I'm sure she's coming. Well, there's a big thing going on, and we have news coming up, and nothing is happening. So I said, if we pull that camera around there, can you punch it up, and can you get somebody on the phone, and so I can talk to somebody? And they say, yeah, well, I think we can do that. And so I go over to the assignment desk, and I find a list of names, and only one name I recognize that I met before, a guy named Dan Lewis, who was a weekend anchor. And I get his number, and I call him and say, Dan, it's Bryan Norcross, the new news director. Remember me? We met the other day. I said, I'm going to call you on the phone. Where are you? Oh, you're in Hurstbourne. That's part of Louisville. And I said, I'm going to call you on the phone, and I'm going to be on TV, and I want you to talk about what you're saying. And he's like, what? What are you doing? I said, Fran's not here. I'm going on TV. I'm going to put you on the phone. Just tell me what you're seeing out the window. And so we did that. and I ripped all the stuff off the wire, and I would kind of go through that. And then here's Dan Lewis is in Hurstbourne. Dan, what do you see? And anyway, and the little cut in went well. And then we did another one and another one. And then by 8 o'clock, people had come in, and I kind of anchored with Fran at 8 o'clock for a while. And then I went off because more people came in to be on the air, and I was managing the coverage after that. But But it was a funny moment, and the newspaper noticed. They noticed that we were the only ones with any coverage on that morning because nobody else could get to the TV station.
I mean, that's absolutely incredible to have that kind of drive just to get, just to get on air so you can let people know what's going on. If nobody else is doing it, I mean, that's why I can fast forward to your 92 coverage of Andrew, and it's like a no-brainer. Like, of course you were going to be on the air for 23 hours because you, through this snowstorm, you drove to a building you had only been to once, navigated it, figured everything out. I can tell you turning the lights on probably wasn't even that easy with all the switches that were in that room.
No, it wasn't.
And so fast forward to 92, it's a no-brainer. That's an incredible story, and I think it kind of foreshadows what goes on throughout the rest of your career, is just making sure that people have information, people that they have safe access to it, and that it's accurate, and then they can take action on it, right? And we'll fast forward to 92 with Hurricane Andrew. I wasn't here. I moved down here in 94 as a kid. And, when you hear about hurricanes and everything else, I lived in New Jersey. We didn't really have storms, right? The only storm I can even recall going up there is Sandy, and that was more recently, right? And I know a few have touched, but when I moved down here and all my friends are talking about Andrew and this storm, and it's the worst one they had ever seen. But nowadays, when I look at storms coming and it's like, oh, this one's going to turn up, this one's going to go under us, this one's not going to hit. A lot of people say, yeah, but remember what happened with Andrew. And when they say that, I don't know because I wasn't here. And for some reason, I've just never looked it up. But I have the expert. Were there warning signs before Andrew that it was going to be as bad as it was? Were there signals? What was the expectation of South Florida as Andrew approached? I mean, it's a different world in 92.
Well, there were two things. A, it was a different world, so we didn't have expectations that 3 or 4 or 5 days ahead we would really have a good idea of what's going to happen. We would know the storm was generally coming. There were satellites, you could see it, right? We're here, it's there, it's coming generally this way. So we had that kind of awareness, but forecasts only went out 3 days then. They didn't even go to 5 days. And and there just wasn't an expectation that they were going to be accurate beyond a fairly short period of time. So, but the other thing is the world wasn't so complicated, right? It didn't take people so long to get prepared. The idea I think that because we give longer range forecasts, people make plans that take longer to come to fruition.
Yeah.
Right. And the other the other really big lesson from Andrew is that on Thursday, so anybody that was here knows that it hit Sunday night, Monday morning. It actually made landfall at 5 a.m. on Monday morning. But on Thursday, the previous Thursday, which would be 4 days in advance, where we'd have cones and everything else now, right? Andrew actually had no circulation. It was just an open circulation. Hurricane hunters couldn't actually close it off, they say. So, and it was offshore, coming this way as a very weak system that would, these days have 40 or 45 mile an hour winds or something like that. So I think the biggest lesson of Andrew is that you can have a system that 4 days in advance is nothing, and you would in no way prepare in a big way for, and it still can come ashore as a monster Category 5. Just destruction machine. As a matter of fact, there's in the record book goes back to 1851. And obviously, when you go way back, exactly how strong storms were is somewhat less certain. But the ones that we know about that were Category 5, there are 4 in the record book. Every one of them was a tropical storm 3 days before. So, I mean, this is to me the number one hurricane lesson for people, for businesses, for anybody, is to not try and predict that a storm will not be strong. Now we understand better why these things happen, but Hurricane Michael, you mentioned in the Panhandle, Andrew, of course, the 1935 storm that just decimated, completely destroyed the Middle Keys, and Hurricane Camille, 1969, all were tropical storms 3 days before. So that's the huge lesson there.
See, now that's going to be in the back of my mind every time a storm like this one that just passed was very unorganized as it approached our coast. And, after it hit us and I think the Carolinas, it reformed into a hurricane. And that's not something that you expect. It's definitely not something that I expect. So, I can see, especially after we've been so much through so many of them, that preparation should almost be systematic to people now. We've done it so many times, and it's really, I don't want to play it off, but it's not that hard to prepare for a storm. I mean, watch the news. If you have shutters or things that are a pain in the butt to do, you can kind of wait till 2 days before, maybe just make sure you have time to get those up. But buying all your supplies and everything else, that's just buying more of what you would buy anyway for the most part. So I can see that people really need to just take this systematic approach. Now, one of the things I like to address, mainly because I am a technology dork, is for that 92 broadcast, I read that your station had prepared for its hurricane coverage for about 2.5 years prior to that, investing in different technologies and making sure that pieces of the system that allows you to get on air were redundant and backed up, that it was actually a major effort to be able to do what you did that was started years before.
Yeah, we used every backup system there was, but we had backup systems, and we were also somewhat lucky. So it started I was hired by, it was Channel 4 back then. I was, and the station numbers have all changed, but I was hired in 1990, January 1st of 1990, to be chief meteorologist. I had been working at Channel 10. Ironically, when I came to Miami in 1983, I came to work at WPLG. It was the #1 station. It was a great, great TV station with iconic people. Ann Bishop was the lead anchor there. Don No was a great weather guy. And I did this. So I was sort of the number 2 or 3 weather guy. And so at the end of the 80s, I was offered the job to go to what was then Channel 4 to be chief meteorologist. Well, I was not the best known guy in town. I was, I don't know, there were 3 or 4 in terms of being known in town. And so they said, well, what can we do to make the weather special? And they actually hired me because I have production expertise. And remember I had a news background and I said, well, I think we ought to be the hurricane station because nobody is doing that. Through the 80s, nobody was paying attention to hurricanes. When I came here, it was just not part of the conversation. Hurricane seasons came and went. Okay, we watched it a little bit, and there was a bad one in '89 that hit just north of Charleston, South Carolina. I went up and covered that. But it wasn't part of life to really have hurricane angst here. And so the stations really didn't have a plan and so forth. So I said, I think we should do that. And so, well, what do you think we need? And so I made a whole big document, but this is what we need, right? This is what we ought to do. And that evolved over, the first thing we did is we built a weather office called the Storm Center. And that was the first South Florida weather office that was sort of a separate thing. It wasn't just somebody sitting at the desk, and pointing to the map. So, we got organized and we put in backup systems and a backup connection to a second radar. If the Miami radar failed, at that time, there was a backup radar in West Palm. And we did a number of things. And then over time, I got to learn more about the TV station, learn more about the technical failings. One was that the tower, all of the Miami, Fort Lauderdale television stations broadcast on transmission towers that you see along the Dade-Broward line. There's a whole string of them now, right? Well, the tower, the first tall tower up there was Channel 4's tower back then. And that tower was from the 50s, 54, as a matter of fact, and it was condemned. By the time the 1990s came along, that tower was condemned. And they were building a new tower. And I thought, well, this isn't good that we're going to be here in a hurricane zone with a tower that's condemned, because towers come down on hurricanes sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes, and they did indeed in Andrew, but not those up there. And so I thought, besides that, nobody's going to have power if we have a bad hurricane. So we need a radio partner. So I went around and shopped radio stations, and I made a deal with the general manager of Y100. And
Mm-hmm.
and so I remember going up there. So this was early '92, going up there to Fort Lauderdale. Their studios at that time were at Sunrise and Federal Highway, where if you go, you take Federal Highway, you're going toward the beach, and then it curves north again. So they were right there at that corner, kind of across from the Gateway Theater, and I made the deal and headed back. And then I got to thinking, wait a minute, if there's a big hurricane, that's in an evacuation zone. So when it came time to order for us to order at the TV station, order the connection line, the hardwire line that at that time you ordered from the phone company. I said, let's run it to their transmitter and then run another line from their transmitter to their studio. And that is connect them together at the transmitter normally, because we normally want to communicate with the studio. But then if there's a big hurricane and they have to evacuate, we can just take that line and connect it directly to the transmitter. Well, that all got tested out 1 week before Andrew, on August 17th, 1992. The engineers came to me and said, I just talked to the chief engineer at Y100. You're good to go. We have the audio line. It's all good. Great. So, and then that was the week that it started. And sure enough, come that Sunday, they evacuated their studio, and the Y100 engineer went out and took that pair. It was literally a copper pair, connected it into the transmitter, a Y100 transmitter. So it was just our audio on the Y100 transmitter that night and through the storm. And so that was I think, the main backup system that we put in was that hardwire line. Now, because there had been some partnerships between radio and television before, but generally the radio station would just take the off-air signal, which was our original plan, the off-air signal from the TV station. A lot of them are even on the cable or something, So I always say in these kinds of scenarios, okay, if the cable goes out, whatever, what's your plan, right? Because you've got all these news people sitting at the TV studio, you've got a radio station over here. What's your plan to make a connection between those two places? If you lose, over the air, if you lose power, if you lose, cable, whatever goes out, the normal connection goes out. What's your plan? What's your backup plan? Because you're nothing if you don't have that communications link. So later on, at the other Channel 4 that I ended up working at, we had 7 different connections to the radio stations, all the way down to a walkie-talkie, these two-way walkie-talkies that we could connect into an antenna that we would climb up on a pole and put up on the antenna. And then we had just a plain audio feed that we could plug into the walkie-talkie that they could receive, obviously low quality kind of audio, but we tried it, and sure enough, it worked. We had it with something called a Marty that was a higher quality system, audio only system. So we had a bunch of this stuff kind of squirreled in the closet, so that if the traditional way of communicating failed, that we would still have communication. So, that was the lesson. The number one lesson from my time at Channel 4 WTVJ back then from Andrew was that preparation works, right? Wow. And I wrote a book about this, by the way. My book, it's called My Hurricane Andrew Story. I wrote it for the 25th anniversary of Andrew. And I talk about the mental process of developing the plans and then what we used and what we needed.
The whole story is incredible. And I do want to touch on your book, just the wherewithal, because as I think about it from a business standpoint, right? Okay, what kind of station are we going to be? We're going to be the hurricane station. I mean, fast forward to today, when a hurricane's on, we're glued to the news, and that's ratings. I mean, at the end of the day, it is still ratings. So from a business standpoint,
but it's a money losing situation, because you don't have advertising, and
that's
you
true.
You do get viewers, and it's very, it's the most important service the TV station can offer here is big event emergency information, but you don't make money. I mean, all broadcast stations lose money during that hurricane coverage. After the fact, radio stations especially, they get a lot of insurance money. They get all kinds of insurance companies that want to advertise, but unfortunately, there is no real financial support for doing a lot of hurricane coverage.
Well, that makes sense. But, my thought behind it is by putting out good, because you're not taking advantage of a situation. You're making sure people are prepared, and you went to great lengths to do that at least to get you the recognition that this is what we did. And you talk about all these redundancies that are in place now down to the walkie-talkie. And that's something that we preach to businesses down here. Obviously, they're not going to have to, at least depending on the nature of their business, stay working for 23 hours through a storm, but they're going to want to get up and running so they can operate as soon as the storm passes and it's safe to do so. So it's interesting, a storm like Andrew, because typically, and it's a good thing, the newscast and the warnings are worse than the storm. And I think that's kind of how we want to keep it, right? So this way you prepare for this level of storm. If it comes in at this level, it's like, okay, at least we were prepared for it here. Everyone's safe. We got through it, as opposed to Andrew, where, okay, it's loose, you don't know. And then boom, it just comes out of nowhere and surprises you. Going into that weekend with the storm, I'd be shocked if anyone said, Brian, you're gonna stay on air for a full day. How did that kind of manifest into? Is it just like you happen to be on air? It was your go around, and you're just like, I have to do this. I have to stay here. I have to make sure people are okay and get them the information. I mean, how did you end up doing a marathon newscast?
Well, that was sort of my job. I was the hurricane guy, and it was my hurricane plan. Now I say it was my hurricane plan. The assistant news director at the time was a guy named Jim Ogle, and he put together a hurricane operations plan. He had a big, thick book sitting on his desk, and he and I, worked together on this. But in terms of the broadcasting plan, in terms of what I would do and what the systems were and that kind of thing, that was my plan. So that was, I was fully ready to do that. But by Saturday night, it was clear that it was going to be a very bad storm for South Florida. Remember, this happened overnight, Sunday night into Monday morning. So Saturday evening, when we were on the news, the 11 o'clock news, we went on and on and on and on. It was getting to be 1 o'clock in the morning. And so I went to the news producer. I said, look, we can stay here all night, but that's not what we need to do, because tomorrow is the day, right? This is going to happen tomorrow, right? So, so we agreed that we would go off. So it was about 1:10, 1:15. I said, folks, I'm going to go home now and get some sleep, because tomorrow is going to be a very big day in the history of our city, and we may not sleep tomorrow night. So let's get some rest. We'll pick it up in the morning, and we'll go through it. And that's what we did. So, that I was fully anticipating that. I couldn't imagine or picture the hellacious events that would happen. But during the day on Sunday, it just got progressively worse up to a point. In the afternoon, the storm hit Eleuthera in the Bahamas. It was a very well-developed hurricane. They were estimating the winds at 150 miles per hour at that time. Now they estimate that they were 170 sustained. And so, we were all well aware in the late afternoon that was coming. But then through the evening, it weakened, which these strong hurricanes do, this sort of up and down kind of thing. And I elected not to talk about the weakening. I elected to talk about still a strong hurricane is coming, because back then we didn't really know. And even today, the difference is today, everybody can go on their phone and look at the radar, and they can, and you have, 10,000 different opinions about what's happening to the storm. So everybody would know the storm is weakening. So you have to talk about it. But I didn't do that back then, because I didn't really have the mechanism to explain why it was weakening. I would use where it was an eye wall replacement cycle. We knew that. But the thing was that the Gulf Stream was ahead of it. And the concern was that once it hit the Gulf Stream, which is like the most supercharged hurricane fuel, that it was going to really kick it back up and kick it. And it's exactly what happened. And so it actually was intensifying and continued to intensify after it came ashore because it was on such an intensifying upstream. So that didn't really happen until after midnight. So, you know, there was no place to go, right? Nobody was going home, right? Nobody was going to sleep, right? So there was no place to go. So, you know, and then the real intense part of this, you know, occurred between midnight and 6 a.m. By the way, you know, Hurricane Wilma, I was on the air for 30 and a half hours straight. From that storm took for freaking ever because it came from the Yucatan and it was moving slowly. Andrew was moving fast, and it started to affect the lower Keys. Well, we cover the lower Keys just like we cover Miami and Fort Lauderdale, and so we were on the air from the time it started to affect the lower Keys, and then it had to creep all the way past the Keys, all the way across the state, and then through the metropolitan area. So that was a lot. That was
the one that went under us and then hooked back around, correct?
No, that was the one that came ashore south of Naples.
Okay.
The Everglades. Right? It was a big circulation. It sat over the Yucatan. It really mauled Cancun and Cozumel, especially Cozumel. And then it finally came this way, and it came directly, well, a little bit diagonal. It ended up going, the center of the eye ended up going out over Palm Beach County. But we had this big eye wall that came in. But anyway, the point was that, you know, it never was anything on the scale of Andrew, but it was just a long event. So anyway, that was my record. There were a few others that were in the high 20s as well, a couple others. So it's a crazy thing. What can I say?
So I'm not upset that I missed your coverage of that because I wasn't here for the storm. I was in Tallahassee for that one. And, you know, we don't have the same hurricane coverage up in North Florida, but for my safety, I'm glad that I missed both of those broadcasts. But, you know, obviously I know that you've done amazing work, and people saying, Andrew, that you were responsible for saving lives and making sure that people understood what that storm was like. And I know that's something that's still very important to you. You wrote the book about your I think it's My Hurricane Andrew Experience, talking about that. And I even saw that you wrote recently, you did an interview about the book talking about how you don't believe that we are prepared for another major category 5 storm. And I don't disagree with you. You know, if we look at the numbers, and I took this from that interview, from 1926 to 1969, 14 category 4 or 5 storms made landfall. And from 1970 to 1916, only 3 of those storms did. So that you would think, by looking at those numbers, okay, maybe storms aren't getting as strong, or we're not getting hit by strong storms. But if we look at the actual activity in hurricanes, from what I understand, and I'm by no means an expert, I know technology, I don't know meteorology. Took one class at Florida State, and I know you went to Florida State, so maybe I kind of know. But, you know, we just haven't been hit by that storm yet. The storms that are forming, when they are getting powerful, they're becoming more powerful. I mean, and there's talk about maxing out the top end of the category 5 category at this point. You know, is this something that we need to be concerned about? And what, I don't want you to dive too deep into the things you talk about in your book, but at least give us a little preview of what you've learned and how we can apply those lessons to the future.
Yeah, the book is My Hurricane Andrew Story. It's you can get it on Amazon if you're interested in Hurricane Andrew. It's I would say it's about 40% about preparation and the whole process of thinking about it, and then the rest is actually about what happened and what we went through. But the point is very important, because people think that we're having, even here in South Florida, a lot of hurricanes right now, right? Not compared to, if you talk to your grandparents who lived here in the 40s, they know these hurricanes used to happen every year. Big hurricanes used to happen every year. And indeed, in 45 and 47 and 48 and 49 and 50, a category 4 hurricane hit South Florida every one of those years. right? In fact, the last Category 4 hurricane to hit Miami. Now, obviously, Andrew hit South Dade, but to hit Miami was 1950. So you really have to go back to then. And then in the late 20s, we had the monster hurricane. If it were to happen again in the 1926 so-called Great Miami Hurricane, if that were to happen again, the estimate is that would be the worst natural disaster to have ever occurred, with a $250 billion price tag on it, because that took out Miami and Fort Lauderdale. I mean, it was a huge storm. So it wasn't a which one. It was, and it completely wiped out Hollywood and Dania and Miami Beach, and it was all of Southeast Florida. So it was a giant hurricane. Then 2 years later, in 28, another giant hurricane comes along, and this is the one that killed all those people up around Lake Okeechobee. It ended up hitting Palm Beach County. So these were these giant monster Category 4 kind of storms that were occurring then, and we're hitting Florida. We've had some of these and some storms like that, but luckily they haven't hit Florida in a long time. So the storms of the past are indeed much worse than the storms that we have encountered, generally speaking. Now, Andrew is a huge, asterisk on that, right? Because for people that lived in South Dade, south of South Miami, Andrew was the storm. It's hard to imagine anything being worse, but we were able to recover so well from Andrew in large measure because after the storm went by and things got sort of sorted out a little bit, Miami and the rest of Miami-Dade County and Broward County got back to normal, were functioning, and were an economic engine to support the process going on in South Dade, as hellacious as it was for people that were stuck down there. I mean, it was just beyond imagination how horrendous it was for that first several months, for people that didn't have the means, to get out and reestablish themselves somewhere else. It was just unbelievable.
Yeah, and you had said that if Andrew hit 10 or 12 miles north, that you probably wouldn't have been able to recover as well because of the infrastructure that would have taken out, which would affect most of the things that we have for tourism, the airport and downtown Miami and everything else. And 10 to 12 miles in hurricane terms is not a very far distance. I mean, that's like, hey, he shot at me, but the bullet went right here. It's
right. Yeah. So I lived in Coconut Grove at the time, and I remember cleaning up my yard from Andrew because the yard was kind of trashed. But I remember being out there cleaning up my yard and dragging stuff out to the front, where the trash people would come, or the people come. Back then we put a big pile of debris, and they would come and pick it up, and really feeling this profound sense of guilt, because only 7 miles to the south, where my friend lived, the house was trashed, the neighborhood was trashed. All I was doing is cleaning up some debris, and my house was fine. I had some superficial damage, but it was nothing. So it was only 7 miles to the south that it was drastically different. As you drove down Dixie Highway, when you got to Kendall Drive, it was noticeable. But when you got to 120th Street, it was destruction after that. And then, of course, you had these corridors of hellacious destruction when you got farther south. But 120th Street, it was like a switch was flipped, and everything you saw was seriously damaged or destroyed from that point south. But it was just so close. And I don't think the city would be the same today if Andrew had hit. If you take out the port, you take out Miami Beach and South Beach and the airport and the banking district, Brickell Avenue, it just would have evolved differently. Would have taken time for
I even hate to say it. it might even expose, we know what's going to happen with Miami Beach with storm surge, right? It goes underwater. I mean, even with a king tide or a bad storm, it happens now. So I can only echo the sentiment that we probably aren't prepared for a Category 5 storm. And I don't need to get into city planning and all that other stuff, because I'm sure, I have no knowledge on that. But when we look fast forward to today, we're in 2020. How people can prepare for this kind of stuff. I can tell you, our company, Wheelhouse IT, having the responsibility of helping a lot of our clients get through storms just from a technology standpoint. I know my colleague Rory has an SOP book probably about that thick, maybe a little thinner than yours was back in 92 with Andrew. But, and we share that with our clients, and we help them prepare, and we feel very obligated, not just for our clients, but also our employees, to make sure that they understand what's going on and that they have the proper time to prepare. We even actually have a website, and I'll shamelessly plug it here, wheelhouse.com/storm, where we take a lot of the information being shared by the National Hurricane Center and anything we get our hands on, to make sure that people who are on our website can find that and make sure they're prepared, and have different resources like FPNL and emergency numbers and all that. We're by no means tracking the storm and making predictions, but just, hey, if you need one place to get your resources, that's where you can go. How would you recommend people kind of preparing, and the steps they should take when storms are coming, or just for hurricane season in general? Because it's only a matter of time before you don't take that one storm seriously, and it can change everything.
Yeah. Well, so the first thing is that, on the upside, a lot of things happen for Andrew. Andrew is the most important modern hurricane in terms of changing how we deal with hurricanes. And one of the really good things that happened after Andrew is that the building code here was fixed. It was an excellent building code before Andrew, but it had loopholes, and those loopholes were filled. So we have the best hurricane building code in the world here. People all over the world refer to the Miami-Dade code. And does that thing you're proposing meet the Miami-Dade code? They'll ask in Jamaica or wherever, right? So that's to the good. So the first thing to prepare is be sure that whatever your structure is, that you meet the Miami-Dade or the Broward County building code. They're essentially the same building code, and it's very, very, very good. On the downside, of course, the insurance world got completely screwed up by Andrew. It never has recovered. Insurance is a horrendous problem now. Many people are underinsured. It's a very difficult problem now, and emergency management systems are better. So you have kind of better and worse since Andrew. But the other thing that's changed since Andrew is that our communication systems have become much more precarious. We're so dependent today on the internet for almost every kind of communication that we have, right? I mean, television is dependent on the internet, radio is dependent on the internet, let alone telephones are dependent on some sort of IP kind of connection, right? So that's just much more precarious than when you could tune into a TV signal that would be snowy and have ghosts, but you could still get the information, right? If it's a digital signal, it either works or it doesn't work, right? And thankfully, we still have analog radio in this country. Some countries in Europe have switched to all digital radio. But most people don't have portable radios like they did, and they don't rely on radio for news as much anymore. And radio stations are not as robust in their news coverage, and television stations don't have the kind of staffs that we used to have. And so it's, in spite of the fact that where I work at Channel 10, we have excellent people and a really excellent experienced plan, but the systems are not as robust as they were for emergencies in 1992. And it's also the other challenging thing is that it's harder to communicate with people today than it was then. You mentioned earlier about why do people gravitate toward television? Because with television, they kind of feel like they're getting a whole message. There's no really good other place where you get a sense that you get some kind of full message, right? There's thousands of places to get little snippets of a
Yeah.
message, a little opinion, a little fact. Take out the problem of people that don't know what they're talking about expressing opinions. That turns out, I don't think, to be a big problem, honestly, in hurricanes, because people do tend to gravitate toward more official information than they do on an average day. But in this society, very, very polarized society, people don't trust authority. They don't trust the government. They don't trust. They look for other opinions, and they end up with these snippets, and they form their own ideas. So it's just harder now than it was in 1992, where people would tune in and listen and believe or not believe, but they would get the whole picture. They would get, they wouldn't kind of get a little bit and then go off and have an opinion, right? And so it was just plain easier to talk to people and to get them kind of thinking in the same direction back then than it is now. There's no venue to have as high an impact now as there was back then.
Well, sir, I've taken up more than an hour of your time, and I really appreciate you doing this. This has been incredible information. Your story is absolutely amazing, from the first story I read in 78 through 92 and what you continue to do today. And I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but the less I see you constantly on my TV, the happier I am, because that means that we don't have the threat of a storm. But, we'll definitely tune in to get the information when we need it. Thank you so much. And is there anything that we can promote before we get out of here?
If you're interested in Hurricane Andrew, go on Amazon, My Hurricane Andrew Story. I write, by the way, a post every morning. If you go on local10.com and you put in Norcross there, you can actually sign up and have an emailed to you every morning about what's going on in the tropics, just to keep up with it. If you could give your users that link to sign up for the Bryan from Bryan Norcross. It's called From Bryan Norcross.
Okay.
And also we do podcasts every week. If you're on your podcast app, if you look up Bryan Norcross podcast, so that comes out every week. And I have a website called hurricaneintel.com, which takes the National Hurricane Center information and puts it in an easier to use format. And people tell me that they appreciate that. It's easier than sorting through all the information on the National Hurricane Center site. So maybe you're already doing something like that on your site, but hurricaneintel.com, check that out.
If we are, probably not to the level that you are. And then the last thing before we let you go, we've got another month and a half left of hurricane season. Are we expecting a busy end of the season, or it's, not an official opinion, just...
Yeah, all indications are it's going to be a busy hurricane. There's no reason to think it's not going to be busy hurricane season. The water is warm. The general atmospheric pattern is conducive for development. It all just starts, in theory, on Thursday. The peak of the hurricane season nominally starts on August the 20th and goes on for about 8 weeks. That's when 85% of the strongest hurricanes, Category 3 and above, occur during that time. So, we've had all this noise this year, right? But it's all noise, right? This is what counts from now on. This is when the storms develop way out in the Atlantic and have plenty of time to gain strength, to grow, and so forth, if they can. And most don't, thankfully. But there's, it's a crapshoot. There's no way to know whether one is, but there's no reason to think that they're not going to. It's nothing that we look at that says this would be anything less than an active hurricane season at some level.
Absolutely. Well, we'll definitely tune in, and we'll have you keep us informed, and all we'll do is just aggregate the information that people need to see it. Thank you again for doing this. Folks, this has been another episode of In Your Wheelhouse, and we'll see you next time.